News in Your Money, the amount of federal money, the government spending, is the chief focus of my next guest. He is Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, a possible contender for the Republican nomination in 2012. He wants a constitutional amendment to the federal government to knock it off. Governor Tim Pawlenty is with me this morning live in Minneapolis. Sir, good morning to you. A couple days before New Year. Happy New Year to you. Tell me about your idea. You want the federal government to have a law, a constitutional amendment that says if you're not taking in X amount of dollars, you cannot spend X amount of dollars. Go.
Well, yeah, we have in Minnesota a proposal that says we're going to quit guessing what the revenues are going to be in the future because they're almost always inaccurate, and so we're going to base our spending projections on what we actually took in the door in the current budget cycle. So we're not going to be in the future making spending obligations based on hopes and wishes, but we're going to wait until we have the money to pay for it. I think it's common sense. I think that's how most families and businesses operate. That's what we should do in government. And at the federal level, I proposed a balanced budget requirement for all the reasons your earlier guest was suggesting. The federal government is running a Ponzi scheme. It's a Ponzi on the Potomac. They cannot continue on this current course. And that $12 trillion debt figure that you used earlier is just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at all of the unfunded liabilities of the United States federal government, it's $65 trillion. They take in only $2.2 trillion a year or so in revenues. That math just doesn't work.
You know, Governor, I hear your point. It doesn't seem to me that many people are listening to you.
Well, I think more people are listening now than they were before. You're seeing the public's opinion on this begin to shift. Of course, jobs are the most important issue, and terrorism, but not far down the list increasingly is federal government spending and government spending generally. So I also would suggest to you this. We can't just trust that we're going to send more politicians to Washington and they're going to change this. We need a mechanism to enforce it, because regardless of which party's been in power, they have not done a good job over time of getting these budgets to balance.
So you have two proposals, one in your home state of Minnesota. You've got one that you're pushing out at the federal level. We had an economist on yesterday who was talking about this very idea about a constitutional amendment. He says the federal level, it'll never happen. I'll get you to respond to that too, but do you think you have a better chance on the local level in Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota we might. We have a legislature that's controlled by the other party, and they don't like my idea of restraining spending. But as we continue to have these budget and spending fights in Minnesota, they may be more open to it, because the system we have now is broken in terms of the way we budget and forecast. And I would concede at the federal level it is an uphill climb for a balanced budget, but we are headed towards, I think, a financial calamity in this country. And as more people get more enraged by this, and they will, I think this idea may get some more traction.
You know, and this goes back to the arguments we had in the 1980s, that many would argue that deficit spending can actually pull you out of a recovery. Can it?
And I think you could make exceptions for certain things, like war, like natural disasters, like declared emergencies. And I would go so far as even to compromise to say, okay, if you need to run a little bit of a deficit for a little while, it can't be more than a certain percentage of GDP. But what we have now is out of control. It's reckless. It's irresponsible. Sending more politicians to Washington and doing more of the same isn't going to work. So we need a mechanism like this.
Well, there are critics back in your home state who argue that the cuts that you've already made at the local level have already they've hurt low-income people when it comes to health care benefits. How do you defend yourself when they say, listen, you're cutting in certain areas where you should not be cutting?
Well, in Minnesota, with the exception of things like military and veterans and K-12 schools, we've cut just about everything because our government's growing too fast. We're on a pathway to financial problems, not unlike the federal government, so it has to be reined in. When everybody else is tightening their belt, families, small businesses, government should do the same. Most of the people in Minnesota understand that. So while the cuts have been difficult, they needed to be done. There's no question about it. The same needs to happen at the federal level.
The cuts have been equitable in your state. That's your argument.
Well, they have been, I think, equitable in the sense that we set priorities. We didn't just go across the board and say we're going to cut everything equally. We said some things are important, like our National Guard, like public safety, like our K-12 schools. So they're going to be insulated from cuts. Everything else is going to be on the table.
All right. You've been to New Hampshire. You've been to Iowa. When do you go back?
Well, I don't have any current plans to go back to Iowa or New Hampshire. I do have a PAC at timpawlenty.com where I'm traveling the country trying to help my party and Republican candidates, but I don't have any current plans to go to Iowa or New Hampshire.
Well, we'll be following your travels, okay, whether it's Minneapolis or New Hampshire or Iowa or Washington, D.C., and we'll speak again, okay? Tim Pawlenty, Governor of Minnesota.
Very good. Thanks.
Good to have you on.